Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Just Rusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about Monster Train and its solutions to its equivalent to Mana Screw and Flood, the complexity cost of hidden mechanics, and how much digital cards should be using the fact that they're digital. Many games will have some mechanic by which cards cost more or less. Some don't, or they do it a different way. But they'll cost more or less mana or energy or whatever. And how do you get that resource? Sometimes you can just put any card from your deck upside down and it's a land. Sometimes you have a separate pile and those are your land or sacrificial resource. Like in Inscription, you have a pile of the squirrels that you can use as sacrifice fodder, and you can pick where you draw from, or you draw from both, or whatever variant the game is using. And in some games, your lands are shuffled in, Magic the Gathering, and you have to draw a mix of them and manage that. But it's good to have games be consistent. Card games, you're shuffling a deck of cards together, are beneficial in a variety of ways, but one of them is that you get some variety, or you think on your feet with the controlled, you often built your deck, but also somewhat random, you get a random hand out of that deck, mix of things that you have. So it's nice to have some control in place where the player is not subject to the pure whims of luck, because that's not really meant to be the point or the appeal of these games. It's meant to be that you work within semi-randomized conditions. Having some more or less controls on those conditions can be very valuable. And so here's an example of a kind of unusual one that Monster Train uses. And then there's some about Monster Train 2, which kind of simplified it elegantly. And we'll talk a little bit about Magic the Gathering, a game where people very often suggest implementing these mechanics, but I think it's mostly a deck building issue. Don't shoot, it's just advice. I'll talk about it later. Let's get into it. I really like Monster Train, Just Rusty continues. I think I brought it up in a previous parlay when we were discussing Ascension modes, but for a refresher, it shares a lot of DNA with Slay the Spire, short runs with not a lot of carryover between them, roguelites, deck building, total refresh of your hand each turn. You shuffle it away and then you draw a new hand. Small single turn mana pools which don't grow, starting at 3 mana with the option to increase it through a run. But unlike a lot of games riffing on Slay the Spire's ideas, it has a lot of permanents which stay on the board, with you building 3 layers of monsters to defend the objective at the top of the train. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that is unusual. The Slay the Spire likes often don't have right permanents, is a nice way to think of it. Cool. As in the term in Magic. The demo for Monster Train 2 is currently out and free if you wanted a feel of the basic premise. I think I might play that. Thank you for suggesting it. Not sponsored, just a fan. Just Rusty suggests. Yeah, if you were interested in that, cool. Thank you. One of the rather clever bits of game design in Monster Train 1 was realizing that almost all decks you are making need to get monsters onto the field pretty reliably. You have a champion unit, which is always in your first hand and costs 0 mana to ensure you never have a blank board. There's also another hidden mechanic that monsters gained from certain events. The event is symbolized by a banner or rallying standard, so these are called banner units in the game, are sort of kept in a separate pile from the rest of your deck, and will automatically pull one of these each turn until all of them have been played. These units can also be drawn as a regular draw from your deck, so there's a risk you can draw 2 of these units in the same turn. This mechanic is also hidden for the most part. The game says at events to add a banner unit, but never really explains what this means. Just to break down what's happening here, because it's weird and complicated and we're going to talk about it more later, but I think you did a good job explaining it. Basically, some of the cards have a little tag on them, you could think of it as that they're a banner unit. And when you draw cards for your turn, you're drawing 2, 3, you get a new hand each turn. It's that style of card game, it sounds like. So you're drawing some from your banner pile and some from the normal pile. The game is basically ensuring that you will draw some cards from a pile that can only really be units, like can only be creatures, basically. However, those cards are also put in the game's shuffler for your normal draws, so you can draw some of those normally as well. You're not prevented from drawing them except when you get this kind of draw. And the key thing is the game does not make this explicit. I gather that there are not 2 visible piles that highlight the idea that you're drawing from this, but then also that. And part of the reason the game doesn't do that is probably because, again, of this strange, you're later going to call it quantum state, which I think is a good way to explain it, where these banner cards are in their own pile, but they're also in the main pile, which physically there isn't like a great way to understand that. We're going to get to it in a minute. There's quite a lot of complex design going on here, which if you really wanted to excel at the game, there's a lot to remember. Banner events don't include certain unit types. Lots of factions in the game have expendable units. One faction has 1/1 units with an on-summon effect. Another has edible units, which transfer buffs to other monsters if they survive the turn. Some are candles, which only survive a certain number of turns. And these units never appear in the banner, which means if you're aiming for certain build types, banner events may be more or less valuable to you, and you are going to draw banner units you have, whether you want them or not, I guess. When picking banner units themselves, you can also make some interesting choices with the card's mana values. If you know your banner units all have a high mana cost, you might not take any other cards with more than a 0 or a 1 mana cost, or vice versa. You can then make a deck where you know you're going to be drawing a 1 cost every turn with good value, and then take 2 cost buff cards as you know you'll always have a target for them, and you'll always have higher cost stuff as well, right? There are also times where you might actively avoid taking new monsters at a banner if you already have something which synergizes with your champion and you need it to come out on turn 1 every time because you know you're going to be drawing banner units, so you might narrow that part of your deck so you get it reliably, right? There are also certain units which are good in your main deck but terrible as banner units, such as units whose summon cost is cheaper the more of a certain unit type you have has been played or is in play. On the other hand, if you're a total beginner to deck building games, this mechanic is just going to give you a reliability to make sure your early runs consistently draw monsters. It's not a mechanic that can easily punish the player, it just smooths out inconsistency. However, it does have knock-on effects that once people start thinking harder about deck consistency, they might be adding far more monsters to a deck than they need. The fact that the mechanic is tricky to explain, I have a very good handle on it, and writing it up for this parlay was tough, also means it's hard to remember what it's going to do. Indeed, and again, I think part of it, as you're about to very eloquently make the point, is that it's a very weird, kind of normally not easily possible thing. To have it be that the banner units are in their own pile, which you draw from sometimes, but they're also part of the rest of your deck, which you draw from other times, and that those are kind of dynamically always shuffled together is not a thing you could easily do physically in any obvious way I can think of, except by having 2 copies of the card is probably the easiest way. But even then, when you draw it from your banner, you then need to take it out. Yeah, no, there isn't a way that isn't just a ton of shuffling that I can think of, a really insane amount of shuffling before every single draw that could work out for that. Yeah, that's a mess. Monster Train 2, then, has a much simpler solution to the creature draw problem. Turn 1 is just called Deployment Phase. You draw 1 hand full of just creatures. There are also ways to get other cards to appear or be guaranteed in this phase for setup. And then enemies spawn, and you play your first regular turn. While this system doesn't let you play with as many decision points, it does free up a lot of complexity budget for the couple new systems the sequel's introduced, and is way easier to explain. Partly, I think, because it's something you could represent with a physical deck of cards. We put all of one card type in a pile, draw you a hand, then shuffle them in with the rest. It's far more tangible than explaining that about 5 cards in your deck exist in a quantum state where they exist in 2 separate piles until one of those 2 piles draws one of these cards. In a way, Monster Train really takes advantage of the fact that it's digital. As well, there are a lot of status effects floating around, and exactly what order they happen in can often matter. If you had to run Monster Train as a physical game, there would simply be too much to track. The game also will show projections of which units will be alive and how much damage is going to go each side each turn if nothing changes, just to keep all of this complexity down, and most cards will indicate how these numbers will change before you play them, if you hover over the card before placing it. The main time you'll have to calculate things out by hand is if you need to figure out the outcome of multiple cards before you play them, and the sequel has given you an undo button so that you can rewind if you missed one interaction hidden away somewhere. When a game is so heavily digital in its presentation, I think it's very interesting that a design decision to feel more tangible is such an improvement. Right, and I think that's the key first part of the discussion here, is that This is such a good idea. I think that deployment phase implementation is so elegant, partly because it's just easier to imagine. And I think the key thing for this parlay is that can be considered better because it is easier for the player to use. Having something be more physical doesn't just mean, oh, the player, I mean, it does just mean the player understands it better, but that has the effect of the player can actually use that better. It's not a matter of, oh, it's a digital card game, so leaning into the digital side and those strengths is good. There's also the aspect that if something is more physical, it is simply easier to think about, just for anything. And so your system could be more complicated in ways that would be interesting if the player was able to think about them. The Monster Train 1 example. Or a little less complicated, but because it's so much easier for the player to actually think about, in practice, the player will probably actually use more complexity. This is a concept that I've been trying to find ways to include in videos and discussions a lot recently, but which I'm delighted to find here, that I refer to as converting into amenities in game design and really in life in general, where I think a big flaw in a lot of people's everything really, but game design, is that it's not carefully enough thought about how good of a return on investment this complexity converts into amenities for the player. That is, you could say in practice, how good is it? But the key problem is, for a lot of mechanics, you have to think about how, like, what the path from this mechanic being in the game to fun for the player is. Like, what is that progression? It's not just in practice it's bad. It's like, okay, well, why? And it's because the path from it's a mechanic in the game to the amenity, it being fun, converting it into that amenity is difficult mentally, right, to think about. With the Quantum Monster Train 1 system, it can add a lot of complexity, but because converting it into its amenity is challenging, it's very difficult to get the full benefit of that design. And thus it's very complicated for, again, not having played it, I would just posit maybe a modest gain in complexity. Likewise, this system, which is simpler and loses some complexity, is arguably a better idea because it has a better conversion rate, if that makes sense. Converting it into the amenity of why that system would be fun is just so much easier that even though it drops some theoretical complexity, it probably adds in practice complexity for a lot of people. And this is not because it's just better in practice. You could say that, but I think it's worth looking under the hood and saying, well, it's because the process of converting that into amenities for the player is much easier than in the other games. Now, you can improve it other ways, of course. I bet you could find some way, and I don't know how Monster Train does it, to signify the kind of quantum deck thing in Monster Train 1. I don't know. I'm imagining some kind of cockamamie thing where you make an animation for which of the two decks the card is drawn from, and the banner deck is like a quantum looking, I don't know. It looks like it's in a quantum superposition is not a thing I understand, but that's like the whole point. But you get what I mean. You could animate it in such a way that you kind of saw that the card was coming out of one of two decks, and explain it some way like, I think you did a very good job, Just Rusty. Maybe another way to tackle the concept that would help some people would be to think of them as the banner cards have a much larger weight. When you draw cards, it's with different sets of weights, and the banner cards monopolize one of those draw opportunities while having more neutral weight in the other one. You could even just change the mechanic to accomplish very similar things by having it be that cards have different weights between them. I'm sure you could make a really interesting, very, very difficult to implement physically, but very interesting digitally deck builder where the cards have stats. You have two decks, and a card has a stat that is how much it's weighted for deck 1 and deck 2. That is, when you draw from deck 1 or deck 2, you are how likely to draw this card. It's counted as multiple copies of itself, or however you implement that in the code. Lots of ways you could do it. I don't think that would be all that complicated to make from a programming perspective. but it would be rather difficult for the player to think about. I think it might be easier, the process of converting that system, relatively complicated in theory, with lots of way to manipulate what each of the two decks has, and make really interesting like combo decks, or make one deck really small, or there'd be lots of tactics, right? Much like the Monster Train 1 situation. I think the process of converting into amenities, a system like that that uses weights, as I describe them on the cards, the card just tells you this is much more likely to be drawn from deck 2 than from deck 1, or this can only be drawn from deck 2 rather than deck 1, or this is in both decks equally, or whatever it is, right? I think that you can convert that into amenities a little bit more easily than the quantum system. Although in a way it's like even more complicated to explain my version. I just made an even more overly complicated version, but I think in theory the player can actually deck build with that information a little more easily. It's probably easier to think about the probability. Waves hands vaguely. I don't know. Maybe there's nothing there. On the other hand, the deployment phase thing, again, I think largely brilliant. The idea that there is kind of a rhythm to setting up most card games or deck builders anyway, and then you take advantage of that to have it be that you draw cards in a new way early on to kind of get you off the ground, I think is a really good idea. As a bit of a transition point into the other half of the parlay, where we're going to talk about Magic the Gathering implementations of this kind of thing, and why I personally think that people are really overly high on them and it's actually not that good of an idea, which I feel like is kind of a hot take, but I will explain what I mean, is to suggest that a lot of games do this, and it's a very popular thing to have done. There are games like Yu-Gi-Oh! Where lots of cards do not cost a resource to play. And you might summon more powerful monsters by sacrificing tributing creatures or chaining through a bunch of creatures. I don't know what the new mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh are, but tuner summoning and pendulum summoning, those mechanics, with monsters you have in play. It's kind of Yu-Gi-Oh's core design solution, but it results in games where there isn't as much of it's like everything is combo food, basically, has been my understanding of Yu-Gi-Oh, is that it's very easy to combo off because of that lack of resource. And my opinion is that that much combo ability is almost objectively bad. Like, I get why people like it, but it doesn't lead to a match very often. Maybe in Yu-Gi-Oh! They have found a way where it does. I don't know. I'm just saying I think in theory that's not that good. Completely eliminating all resource management is not good. And I think that's the thing where a lot of people who play Magic just want no land. And I think don't know what the benefits of there being lands in the game are. But also a lot of people just accept it because it's something they say they find fun, and so they won't critique lands at all. I do think lands as a design idea in Magic is not all good. Having to draw a card that is the only way you can get a resource that you cannot play the game without. Well, there are a few decks that manage it, but anyway, I don't think that's good either. And so a lot of card games are kind of balancing the two, not doing the Yu-Gi-Oh thing and not doing the Magic thing. Magic is one of the games that makes it the most involved, the most of a problem to get your resource. Again, I mentioned examples like in Inscription, where you can draw from a deck that is all squirrels. I think they're squirrels. 0 cost, 0/2 creatures, very weak, not offensive creatures, that you can use as tribute fodder, sacrifice fodder for your larger plays. You cannot not be able to get those cards. And there are some interesting bits of design where you can get an item or whatever that will make all of your squirrel deck have an additional ability on them. You can kind of upgrade that separately, which is pretty cool. You could think about this being a physical game pretty easily as well. I mean, the way that Inscription's UI works, I think is designed to help players with this, in that you physically see the decks. It's first person and the decks are on the table where you would need to draw from them. That, of course, is partly done to help the game be more understandable, more immersive, but also I think easier for people to understand. I'm just pointing out that the way that Inscription is doing 2 decks is already very easy to understand because they are very physical. You just have a deck that's all squirrels and a deck that is the rest of your stuff. Like you could easily do that in real life. And so you do kind of have a lands deck where you can pick a squirrel from there instead. Now it comes at the opportunity cost that you need to draw from one place at a time. And so you have to kind of pick, I'm going to take a squirrel versus not, In Magic, this is a really often thing we're going to talk about in a minute, where people just have all the lands in their deck that otherwise has no changes in a separate pile, and they can simply choose when they draw from their deck to draw a land or a non-land. That's a very common thing to do, implementation. I've tried that before in the past, and I will say why I don't think it's that good later, but it's not insane or weird. Like, it's fine, you know. I just think there are some drawbacks too. And it's interesting in games like Inscription, I think, because a lot of the cards are very, like, they come at the cost of it taking some time to deploy the card. That's kind of why it can be interesting. And indeed, I think that's why lands are fun generally, is that they create a kind of pace to the game, having some kind of resource you need to play or like budget out when you get. The Monster Train example in Monster Train 2, where you get a deployment phase, you draw one hand of just creatures or other cards if you set it up there, and then you have a kind of opener phase. I was saying earlier, I like that because it plays into this thing that most card games already have. They already have a vague setup phase. So make that, there's an explicit setup phase. Okay, that doesn't seem like a bad idea. And it goes without saying that there's lots of further variants. Having a champion card that you have every time in Monster Train, very similar to Commander in Magic the Gathering, a very common format where your ratio of lands to creatures should be the same as in other formats. We'll get to that in a minute. It's usually not, and I think that's why most players think lands are such a big problem, because they don't play enough of the damn things. But I've been holding myself back, okay? We'll get into it in a minute. But in exchange for having only one copy of each card in their commander deck, the player gets a card that they always have available, their commander creature, and they therefore kind of always have a play. You may notice that this makes it even better to play more land, because you cannot possibly not have a way to spend that mana, and yet people play less land than in other formats. But I won't let myself boil over just yet. We're still finishing this idea that there are lots of ways that games tackle this issue. So it's really interesting to see that Monster Train is taking in my experience, a less usual route to letting the player like kind of reliably get stuff online. Another example that sticks out to me in my experience is Duelist and Duelist 2. Duelist, in my mind anyway, I don't remember whether Duelist 2 still does this, but I hope it does. And Duelist 1 did this for a while and then changed it, and I think that is the point that it went downhill. But that's just what I think. Duelist has this distinct thing where you draw 2 cards per turn, 2 units per turn. And you also have a mulligan. You can put a card back in your deck and draw a new one once every turn. And there are a meaningful number of cards that interact with that too. Like, you can get more mulligans per turn. And I think even more would be good as well. Duelist 2 then, Duelist and Duelist 2, give you a very high amount of card selection, if that makes sense. You have the ability to look through a very large amount of your deck. And your deck isn't that big. 30 or 40, I forget. I think it's 40. Final answer is 40. So your deck is small, and you look through 2 or 3, if you mulligan, cards per turn. That's really fast. That's with no abilities. No card draw, that would make it more. No more mulligans, that would increase how far you go through your deck. And you can have multiple copies, only 2, of cards in your deck. I really, really like this system. I think it's a really great way to make the player make not only a lot of good plays, because they have reliable things to cast each turn, they draw a lot of cards, so it's important to play some small stuff, even if your strategy plans to go big, because you're always going to have lots of cards coming in. If you play only 9 cost things, you're going to overdraw and waste resources. So that makes smaller plays good. It makes the act of winning the game more about playing a lot of stuff rather than one big thing that just wins you the game, which is often more exciting to lose to, and it's more interesting to play a lot of the time, and it's fun. You get to play a lot of Duelist when you play Duelist. And finally, it means the player gets to make a meaningful decision every turn about what they want to dig for. What do you want to replace, and what are you looking for from that card? You see a lot of new stuff. However, I do think that one of the reasons that Duelist system is fun to a lot of people who like other card games really responded well to that system. And I also think that some players found it a little inaccessible. You're just getting too much new stuff, which that's understandable. I think it is what made Duelist special, so it wasn't a good idea to remove, because it genericizes the game, regardless of whether more or less people like it. If more people like it, I think it's because it's similar to other games, and I'm not sure it's a great idea for it to compete with those, but whatever. Is that it is kind of just forcing the player to have more card draw. I like the idea in Monster Train 2 because it's something that, again, is kind of part of the game, even if you have a good deck. And this is how I'm going to lead into the Magic the Gathering discussion. I would love it if anybody who plays Magic the Gathering, listening to this parlay, tried the thing where you take all your lands out of your deck, don't change either deck, we'll get to that in a minute, and then put them in separate piles and you can choose what you want to draw from. Try that. I have. I think it's fun. It's an interesting game design experiment. But if when you try it, you cannot think of some positive and some negative effects on the game, you are missing some major stuff, and I would politely suggest at least digging into that a little more. I think it can be a fun experience to learn about the way these card games are structured. You should be able to think of at least a few pretty obvious, in my opinion, benefits and detriments to that idea. And then if you decide that you prefer to take those costs, I don't think that's bad. Like I would just want people to know what they were changing if they did that to the game. It's not necessarily a bad idea. However, my thesis for the second part of the parlay is going to be, for any given change you make to these card games, is it a good change just because players do not do a thing that is essentially always beneficial to do in these games? Or is it a good change even if players are making like a good deck in the first place? Does that make sense? So I'll give you some examples. In Magic the Gathering, to read the end of the parlay, this mechanic, just Rusty says, also inspired a pretty interesting conversation with my housemate, who's a Magic the Gathering Commander player, on how theoretical ways to bring these concepts to Magic the Gathering would look and change the game, if it would be an improvement or not. We thought it'd be interesting to try drawing a first hand with from all your lands, shuffling the lands in, and then mulliganing any lands you don't want, having lands in a separate deck for the entire game and letting players draw from either as they choose, a digital version of Magic the Gathering which always drew you a land if you had none in hand. And there are more ways you could implement it, for sure. Now, I'm going to sidestep some things that I think are just less interesting issues, but it will give away as homework for the viewer. This will spoil one of the answers. One of the obvious consequences is that you can play much greedier mana bases, which is already a really big problem for these games. The lands are already a little, it's weird to say because players think so little of them and don't include enough of them. Grumble, but lands are kind of overpowered in Magic as it stands. There are 5 colors of mana, and it's pretty easy to get pretty good lands that tap for 3 of those 5 colors very reliably, or at least 2 colors that will be untapped pretty reliably. That is a little too easy in current Magic. I will just include a little sidebar. If that is your experience, I highly recommend considering simply banning all of the lands that, like fetch lands, essentially. They shuffle, they create a huge amount of shuffling in the game. That speeds games up. They're very expensive because they're very good. There's a lot of benefits. Shuffling your deck with them can often be leveraged to be an advantage in and of itself. They create 2 land triggers for landfall cards. They're kind of broken in a variety of ways, and they cost a lot of money. And if you remove them, you remove relatively few cards from everybody's decks that cost a shitload of money if you buy the official versions. But you could just proxy them, but whatever. And it makes lands much less unbalanced, much less overpowered. Now, that being said, if you had a dedicated deck of just lands and you crafted it to take advantage of that format, you could very easily reliably get a larger mix of mana symbols, and I'm not sure that is a good balance change to the game. That will make already the problematically more ahead decks way more ahead, and single color decks can do very little with this design decision. Like they basically don't benefit at all. Whereas in normal Magic, single color decks benefit a lot from not having to worry about multiple symbols. Not enough, but a lot. And if you shuffle all your lands in and you have a multicolor deck, that's a disadvantage to having a lot of colors of mana that you want to cast your spells. It's not enough of a disadvantage, but it's some of a disadvantage. This is one of the, I hope, somewhat obvious balancing issues to allowing players to do this. You might say, like, we'll just make players not build their decks like that. But it's very difficult to not just have it occur to you that your multicolor decks are better in this situation, and therefore maybe I'll just play those more, and maybe I'll just trim a few lands from some of my decks. I'm not suggesting that players are being dishonest. I'm just saying that putting people in this situation makes it hard to like you have to make your decks actively worse in this format to not take advantage of it, basically. And I think that is problematic for some groups, and also not everyone's friends are as honest as mine or maybe just Rusty's, and will just abuse the system, and that will probably make them win very consistently. I think this seems less overpowered than it is basically what I'm suggesting, but it's very strong. But again, that key point, my thesis for this idea is, do these changes make the game like a more interesting game for people that already build their decks in a way that is good? And I propose that it doesn't. It's not hard to build your deck in a way where you will not ever not get lands, and you will not run out of cards, and you will have something to play with those lands because you have your commander in the Magic the Gathering commander format. Again, a lot like the deployment phase in Monster Train 2, you are going to have a creature every time. So it's not the same situation, but if you just play slightly more lands rather than slightly less lands, and you play some cards that draw you more cards, which are good in literally every single deck ever made, then you won't not have lands. People just don't like to do those things, is my proposed issue. And doing this actually discourages it even more. I would go so far as to say these changes really make it more sense to just remove mana as a mechanic in Magic, which you could do. You could have it be, it is pretty much the same as having a pile of lands you can always draw from, but you could just have it be you gain one every turn, and you delete mana as a mechanic. It's easier to jury rig Magic the Gathering if you just have a separate pile of lands, but if you imagine a theoretical game where you just redesign Magic and remove mana progression in that way, and you have some way to handle multicolor, that would be hard, but you find some way, you're redesigning Magic a little bit, and you remove mechanics like landfall, then I think that would be a better, like, it's better to just not have lands in that case. But lands have many benefits as well. They make a lot of card draw a little bit more punishing, but also advantageous in a new way, in that it kind of averages out the amount of lands you have. They make running a lot of lands and running a deck that can always do something kind of a design decision, and then you can play a more aggressive deck where you take the risk of not getting as much land in exchange for speed, like the ability to just get in there. Again, formats like Commander and Tiny Leaders, play Tiny Leaders, is a great way to kind of hedge your bets on this. You will have a creature to cast, so as long as you play in a way where you have some lands, you're just any lands, and you can take mulligans in Magic, you redraw your hand because you didn't get any lands, you will be able to do the thing very consistently. I'm not trying to be mean, but I would go so far as to say if you play Magic and you consistently do not get enough mana, you are literally just building your deck mathematically kind of wrong, and you can play and essentially never get mana screwed. Obviously, once in a blue moon, your shuffling will just be weird, but it's very easy to build a deck that doesn't feel like it has too many lands, but has a lot of lands statistically. And the reason that this kind of thing happens and is so common in the community in general, I don't know about just Rusty and their friends, is because people don't play enough land. It's because in a 60-card Magic the Gathering deck, you often play 24 lands and 36 non-lands. That's 40% land. And then when you play Commander, a format with 100-card decks, that is then kind of not only not applied, but kind of misapplied. Let's go through it. So your 60-card deck that is neither particularly aggressive nor particularly slow often has about 40% land, right? So if you ported that over to an 100-card deck, without knowing anything else about what the deck does, what is the baseline amount of land that you'll put in the deck? 40, right? At 40% of 100. Or maybe 39, because your commander counts as a card in your deck, but starts outside. So you have 99 cards, 39, sure. I think this is where the trouble begins. No, why did you not keep it 40 and just round up slightly? Because you're playing a game with 3 opponents where you have to do more damage, more magic to kill them all. But people have a tendency to begin by rounding that down. It makes sense to round it up, not round it down, but they'll round it down and then only cut lands from there. Indeed, most commander decks have a ratio, a percentage of land that is more like what you would play a hyper speed aggro deck with 33, 35 lands. That's just objectively not enough. Like that is the wrong amount of land for most people's decks. If you play CEDH, I don't. That's not. I'm sure that does make sense. That's a different format. Magic the Gathering also has double-sided cards that have a land on the back. And I think this is where the conversation gets a little more spicy for people who want to hack the game to get mana screwed less by doing this like pile of lands separately thing. For what are double-faced cards that have a spell and a land on the back, but the ability sometimes to draw a card from your deck and it says you can choose whether you want to draw a land or a non-land. Here are both of them, and it just elegantly fits in. You can play these. Probably should play basically all of these to do something relevant to your strategy in basically every commander deck you ever make, alongside card draw, and again, like rounding up an amount of land, not rounding down an amount of land. If you have 8 to 10 decent sources of card draw, or at least like moving through your deck, maybe 8 sources of modest card advantage where you end with more cards than you started with. You have at least 40 and probably more for most decks lands, unless you have some very specific thing and you know what you're doing. Again, you're playing a CEDH aggro deck or whatever. And you play all of the relevant land and non-land double-faced cards for your strategy. My experience from building dozens of decks like this is that's going to be about 3 for a lot of decks at the moment. Unless they print more, we're getting to it in a minute. If you do those 3 things, you will very likely not have no land in a given game, and you will also not have too much land. You will be able to play non-land stuff consistently, largely because you have enough card draw and you have your commander, combined with the fact that you don't actually have that much more land than the decks that are skimping out on a bunch. You just round it up, and then you have the double-faced cards for lands. That alone would remove this problem for 80% of players. But I do think it's a real question. Why are there not more of those double-faced cards? Because that is a very good solution. It makes non-double-faced lands better. I think this is where this gets really interesting. We are kind of toward the end of the parlay, but I still think we got a good journey, and now we're at a destination that is satisfying. It makes a card that only taps for mana to cast your other cards more interesting if there are cards that are both a spell you can cast for mana and a source of mana, but they're just a little worse at each of those 2 things. All 3 types of cards get better and more interesting if you do that. Much like how I would argue the banner cards in the Monster Train 1 example kind of make non-banner cards interesting in a new way as well. You suggested this idea that if you happen to get a lot of good high-cost banner cards, you're going to be given some of those very reliably. So you might now choose to have your non-banner cards be like 0 and 1 cost things, because you know you're going to have the higher costs handled, or vice versa, the reverse of that. Both mechanics get more interesting because you have the other there. And I think this is true in Magic as well. Really what I would argue is that more kinds of card is more interesting, because then you can do things to manipulate whether that is good or bad. Having a deck that can deal with getting a lot of land, like it has mana sinks, something to dump a bunch of mana into, and that can deal with only getting a little less land. It has the double-faced land and spell cards. It plays a slightly larger than necessary amount of land. It plays card draw, etc. And these are much easier things to do in Commander as well. I'll just point out that's where this is the biggest problem, but it's the easiest to solve in Commander. There are some 1v1 like competitive Magic formats where it's not as easy to do this, because slowing yourself down, you kind of just need to accept that you're gonna have a bad draw sometimes. But whatever, we don't have to do that in our games. You don't have to do that. Just don't play formats where that happens if you're bothered by this. It's not hard. Tournament Magic is somewhat of a mess right now in my opinion, but anyway. And so you can put yourself in a position where you have a game that makes all three choices more interesting. How many of the double-sided land spells do you play? How many just lands do you play? For what advantages? Often the bad land on the back of the double-sided card will come into play tapped, so you can't use it the first turn it's in play, or it does some damage to you. So you get speed, but if your opponent is pressuring you, you now have more pressure on you because you lost some life. This can add up if you have a lot of them. It would add up more if there were more of them to play. In current Commander, where you have 40 life, playing a land or two now and again that does 2 or 3 damage to you to come into play untapped is completely irrelevant. Like, just does not matter at all. That simply does not change the outcome of most games, because there aren't very many of those cards in Magic the Gathering at the moment. But if there were more, they would not only be a more interesting choice, not using them would also be a more interesting choice, because you actually need to not take 15 damage from playing your mana base. And then it would be also better to have untapped lands, of course. Current Magic, if you just ban a bunch of really powerful lands, is actually pretty good at this. There's a good amount of cards that reward you for having like just a basic land, just a normal untapped but only one color land. There's a good amount of stuff in Magic currently that rewards that. It's just that the cards that tap for many colors of land at their very best, the very best of those cards, are so strong at that it often isn't worth taking that. But they're also very expensive, and again, including the fetch lands, they also cost a lot of money. There are many advantages to simply banning all of these cards from your own games. It balances the game in a very, very elegant way. It really is that easy in my humble experience. You can just have the game be much more balanced and more interesting by doing that. And then again, I would largely just glue 3 double-faced land spells to every single deck that can play them. It is a very good idea, in my opinion, to homebrew more double-sided land and non-land spells, and maybe we'll do that sometime. I think that is the thing that would really wake the game up a little more. Being able to draw a card that's only a land can be a very interesting design decision, and it doesn't result in you having no lands. It just causes you to have different texture to your play. You have a little more land this turn, you have a little less land this turn. This is a turn where you don't quite hit that card you were going for, so you do a slightly different play and you hedge your bets. This makes flexible cards better and more interesting. This makes lower costed cards better and more interesting. This makes card draw more interesting than just you have more cards to play. It gives it an additional benefit, and hopefully encourage players to play some. This makes cards that you can spend a lot of mana into more appealing, because you have more ways to get more mana, and those cards are very healthy for the game. That they allow you to close out games that have bloated or stalled. I think it's extremely beneficial all around to just build decks that are better at getting enough land. But it's really interesting how, looking at these mechanics, that doesn't mean that it isn't a good idea to do anything about getting access to your lands in Magic. It just means that maybe the problem that appears to be there, that there are lands at all, is not the same as the underlying problem, which is that the design space for hedging your bets on land is just kind of not there. Like they could easily, and have to an extent, made cards that lean into that idea, but just not enough, not as many as would benefit the game. And not so much that it's like bad to have lands as a mechanic. That's not even getting into a topic very near and dear to my heart that is just different from this parlay, which is land destruction. A subject I think is really misunderstood and can be a very, very cool part of Magic, though again, it's more an issue that they just haven't printed as many of the good kind of land destruction, at least in my opinion. Good for the game, not powerful. They've printed plenty of powerful land destruction. But being able to kind of destroy, attack, or defend that resource can be very interesting. But there's a technique to it. There's a lot of kinds of land destruction that are not fun for the game, I don't think, most of the time. And those are the kinds that we have for the most part. But in my Commander play group, we do play pretty much all of the effects like this that exist, land destruction sources that are not the 2 that I think are bad most of the time. And it is a lot of fun. It does add a lot of texture to those games. If you play Magic, these are cheap single target land destruction is a huge problem because you can lock people out of the game. They're very powerful cards. I'm not saying you shouldn't play them in a competitive format, but for the power level many people are targeting for their commander games. I think these are too strong if used in a good way, and then they just don't do anything if you don't use them in a powerful way. Or mass land destruction. You destroy literally all land, no conditions, there is no land. These can be a very valid strategic play. You get ahead on board, and then you make everybody else go back to square one, extending your advantage to the point where you can kill someone. If you haven't seen these cards used to win a game before, maybe that's why people are so skeptical that they're like doing anything productive. It's not griefing or trolling to blow up everybody's lands if there is any good reason whatsoever to blow up their lands. And if there isn't, you, the player who blew up everybody's lands, probably just lost the game by putting yourself, I would argue, more behind than you were before. So I'm not sure there's a great reason to be salty about these cards. People just don't like, they're not in the habit of seeing their lands get blown up. However, there is a third, darker path, which is blowing up some lands, usually for a lot of mana. These are good because they keep the table at an interesting pace in those tense middle turns and prevent a player from popping off from going as far. The ideal formulation of these, if I could suggest, are where they make people sacrifice lands down to a count or make players with more than a certain amount of lands lose some lands. Or again, they cost a lot of mana, but they're a land destruction engine, and then you're incentivized to use them on a player that has a lot of mana rather than a player that has only a little mana, which sometimes doesn't work out. Sometimes it will be, there is a player that has like 4 lands, and so if you get your engine online quickly, you could just blow them all up, and that's bad. But hopefully by them being high costed, you simply won't be able to get these engines online and keep blowing up lands on the same player that has a meaningfully small number of lands. You just won't be able to do that a lot of the time. Good tactical decisions are often enough here as well. You could screw a player who's getting slow on their lands out of the game by blowing up all their lands, but like, why? You'll spend a bunch of resources on a player who wasn't a threat and then get killed by the player who has a lot of lands, whose lands you should have blown up, who is going to kill you. So there's an element here where it's like they can be kind of toxic and you can just make a player unable to play, but only if you are a complete moron, and you will then promptly lose that game. So I feel like that's not that bad. Like, just don't do that. It's easy. Whereas when land destruction is cheap and only one target, you can very easily just, I mean, who knows if that player is about to kill you out of the game. If it's like turn 2, just blow up their land. And then for all you know, you may have just screwed over a player who was having a weak draw, but it was gonna work out. Or maybe you screwed over a player who had a strong draw and was about to pop off, but it's turn 2, so you have not seen that yet, and you can't really make that decision. So they're very good cards, but they have they're extremely likely to lopside a game, and the power level just isn't necessary for most people's casual tables. Likewise, mass land destruction also, I would argue, is largely not necessary to get a lot of the benefits of land destruction, while making people way saltier when it happens. Allowing people to have some land, but you've slowed down their game plan, is just better in a lot of ways, I think, for a lot of people's climates. So that can be very cool. I definitely think land is a design space in Magic where you can do some good work, but not one where I feel like the problem is lands. I feel like mostly people just build their decks in a way that is like about as bad as you could make them for the land situation. The people who dislike drawing enough land, not drawing enough land the most, build their deck in a way that is as bad as possible at drawing enough land for no real reason. Like, you wouldn't really lose anything if you just did put enough land in your deck. I know people feel like, well, I have to cut 3 or 4 cards, but let me tell you, I've seen some of the decks that have this problem. You can very easily cut 3 or 4 cards. I have a suggestion, actually. I don't mean to be persnickety. I want this to help people. I'm just having fun talking about it more than this is an advice video. Just Rusty and their housemate are probably just fine. But if I could make a suggestion, I think one way that can be helpful to cut decks down, you should put more land in your decks, according to math. And I think you would have fun if you put more in your decks. So that's my suggestion. A way you could do that is by removing cards from your decks and putting them in another deck. Make another deck that does that thing. Many people's decks are really unfocused. If you fleshed out that idea as much as you could, or like put more card draw and removal, filling up some space in both decks, and then just spread the cards in the most focused way among two decks, you would have two more fun, more focused, more functional, very reliable decks instead of one. Like, greedy is the wrong word because it just will not do any of the stuff it's trying to do as consistently. And you will probably have more fun. You'll get to play two decks, which will be very cheap because a lot of the card draw and interaction is not very expensive. The cards physically do not cost very much money. Not they're not a lot of mana, that's true, but they're easy to acquire physically. You can buy them. They cost a quarter, that kind of cheap. And thus, you're put in a situation where you can, for much less money than building two entire decks of the greedy nonsense pile you had before, you will have two decks for not all that much more cost than your one deck that both do their thing better and which give you contrast. You can pick which one you want to play. I think for many people, this is a total win-win-win. Like, just do that, and you'll have decks that play better, and you have two decks, and they both do their own thing even more. The theme you were excited about happens even more. It is a topic for another time to have the experience of wanting to cram a million effects into a deck, even though it would be better to do the thing I just said. I have before done that, even though I almost always do not do that. I have done it for the sake of it before, and that can also be very fun. But again, I think for a lot of people, the shame is they're just going to make a deck that doesn't work. It's not going to be interesting and fun. They're going to make a deck that does not function instead. That probably won't delight you, and I'm laughing like a school child because I've done it before in a way where it did work, and it was a lot of fun, but it was hard. That was challenging to build, and it required even more cutting. It's not a way to get out of cutting cards. It was even more painful than making a deck where you spread them out. So, but painful is the wrong word. You know what I mean? It was more editing work, but the result is pretty cool. Again, maybe a topic for another time. I went on about Magic for a while because I think it's an interesting segue from this subject. I think the idea of like more digital versus more physical implementation is interesting, but a lot of the time I think games lean into the digital a little too much because the game can make it objectively simple to do the thing that the digital stuff does. But the conversion into amenities is still not very simple. That is, the game will automate some of the like actual math you have to do, but the player thinking about that stuff, if it is very non-physical and abstract, making it easy to automate can be very difficult. The player can still have a lot of trouble managing all those effects, and thus, although the system does make it objectively easy to make a card game that works that way, it is still subjectively quite difficult to convert that into the amenity of fun for the player because it is abstract, because it is easy for a computer to mimic. And I would say that it's the case that in Magic the Gathering currently, this is a major flaw, something you might be interested in if you've had a cursory interest in Magic over the years. They're really going, in my opinion, out of hand, not really thinking about this, with new mechanics. There was a new set recently that was themed around racing, and there are at least two, I think three, effects in that set, mechanics, that you need to track a new thing, manually, physically, to use that mechanic. I simply do not put any of those cards in any of my decks, because I can keep track of that, but my opponent isn't as good at that as I am usually, and I'm basically just bullying them into forgetting that an effect is going to come, which means when I win, they just forgot I had something coming that was obvious. That's not fun. It's more fun for them to know I could win off this, try to stop me, but then I outwit them in some way and get a real victory, rather than just like bullying them with my neurons until they forget something that makes me win. That's not fun to me. I just don't think that's fun. And I don't think it's bad if you do think those cards are fun. That's okay. I just want people to interrogate what they are adding. Just as a simple counterexample, I think a way that you can have the best of both worlds is by making theme decks. Make a deck that is like lots of that effect that you have to track externally. So yeah, it is one more thing to think about, but you've greatly reduced the number of things to think about in the deck, except for that iconic thing. That can make it much more mentally manageable for your opponent. They know what your deck is doing and will play an interactive game of Magic with you, instead of you just playing solitaire against the wall. But also you will get to enjoy that mechanic much more. What flavor does that add to the game? Another example I would give would be the enter the dungeon mechanic, a venture into the dungeon from the Baldur's Gate magic sets. This is a mechanic I kind of want to like, but don't, because it's a lot of extra stuff to track. A suggestion would be to just make a deck that's all about that, and you can enjoy it, and it's kind of easier to keep track of because the deck has narrowed to that mechanic. Good stuff, I hope. Yeah, pretty interesting. Again, I'm not saying that it's always bad for the game to track a lot of mechanics. Obviously, there are cases where a mechanic is like kind of annoying to track, but it's fine. Converting it into amenities is not that hard. But it's just much easier if you have it digitally, and so that can work really well. I'm not saying it's inherently bad for digital to ever lean into digital stuff. Not at all. And sometimes an effect is a very simple thing. Converting it into amenities is trivial, but it just isn't something you can as easily do with a physical card, like transforming the card into something else, or like it makes it easier to remember. So for example, in Magic, a good amount of cards will like evolve somehow. They'll flip to their other side if it's that kind of card. Some of them just like get some counters and now it's a werewolf. And it does say it has that ability on the card. But having a digital client literally transform that game piece into a new sprite that is an asset that is that card but with werewolf in its type line and the better updated power and toughness can make it much easier in aggregate to check that, to not look at your board of physical cards covered in dice and tokens and say, okay, this does say what each card is, but it is harder to read than if the card's just morphed by magic into their new form, right? I still think that's good. Hopefully, obviously, there's not really any drawback to that. I still feel like it's premature for a lot of games to pile on complexity, really no matter what, but especially if they're emboldened by that digital format. I think it's still really good to be quite cautious about that and keep in mind that the player has to be able to strategize with this for it to be fun, usually. If we were to talk about this more, I definitely think it would be interesting to dig specifically into that idea that this is a very good beginner mechanic, especially the Monster Hunter 1 one. You don't know Monster Train. I think I've only made the mistake once in this parlay. The Monster Train 1 version of the mechanic, where you just quietly draw more creatures, basically. And you mentioned how for a total beginner, this is probably just going to make your deck more reliable. It would be interesting to lean into that idea more and have a whole discussion about these mechanics that are quite good for a new player, but are like a bit of a thorn in the side of a more advanced player, or a player that starts thinking harder about deck consistency will begin to be very troubled by the existence of this mechanic. I held myself back in this parlay from talking about the Magic the Gathering Arena Shuffler, which anyone who's played and knows about that was probably screaming this whole time. I know, but it's a topic for another time. Well and truly it is, because that's tangled up in things like the number of matches and stuff like that as well. Anyway, what a wonderful parlay. I kind of went longer on this than I should have. Well, and to be fair, maybe you didn't want as much Magic the Gathering as I talked about, so just in case, it kind of became extra time on the parlay. If you'd like to submit a parlay like this one, we'd love to have you. You can do that using a link in the description. It can be a short or long, weird or terrestrial, game design related or not topic. Happy to help or talk about whatever you like. Just use this as a service by which you can pay me a small fee to have my brain work on an idea you're interested with you for a month. I'd love to have you. It's a lot of fun for me. Looking forward to the next one.